Hello everyone and welcome back to Calm 350. Today is February 6th and we are finishing up Rome and we are talking about Quintilian specifically. I had you read his actual work because I wanted to torture you. No, not necessarily, but because it is important for us to understand that Quintilian, less than Cicero, did not give us a textbook on how to speak in public, but he spends the entire time really in defining what an orator is, what oratory is, what rhetoric is, what science is, art, and he has a very specific reason for doing that. If you did not read Plato, Isocrates, Aristotle, if you didn't read Cicero, any of them, reading the first part of Quintilian's work will give you a really good sort of review of what those particular philosophers thought about rhetoric and how to define it. The question of why is this important to Quintilian goes to the time period in which he's writing. We know that Cicero was writing during the Roman Republic, and with a more decentralized power like a republic, you have a greater need for rhetoric. And so he wrote us this textbook of how to speak in public by organizing Aristotle's 5 canons and putting them in an order that he was very intentional about and describing each of them in great detail. We all know that Cicero was murdered for this belief that he had that we should empower people. The decentralized government was fading away and a more centralized approach was desirable. And one of the first things they did was kill Cicero. Some people might argue that the day that Cicero died was the day that the Republic died. And what picked up? Well, we actually fast forward 200 years to about 100 AD when we really start to understand what the Roman Empire was starting to look like. And in the Roman Empire, you could not speak against the empire in any way. You should not empower people with the power of speech. And Quintilian knew this. He knew this because he was up in the upper ranks of government based on his family. So he knew he couldn't write like Cicero did, but he really wanted to. And he wanted to find a way to talk about those things and praise Cicero, Aristotle, and others without getting himself murdered. So what he did was he wrote what we sometimes call the teacher's handbook to Cicero's textbook. It's not quite as simple as that, but really what he's doing is getting into telling us why we should understand the practice of rhetoric, why we should understand the distinction between rhetoric and persuasive oratory. How he comes to these conclusions is incredibly detailed. And so if you read any of it, you probably quit at some point and was like, why am I reading these extremely minute details of his process of thinking? Well, think about how we walked through this. We came from Plato, a very generalized idea of we're looking for the good, whatever that is, for the philosopher, whatever that is. And Aristotle came along and said, we should look for those things, but what we really need to be looking for is how to practice rhetoric and teach the people how to practice rhetoric, to teach them how the government is communicating with them. And Isocrates, sort of said, well, we don't want that. What we really want is to empower people by letting them, by teaching them how to get the knowledge that we get from the practice of rhetoric, and not just the art of oratory. So we come at it from a very broad perspective, and then we start getting more and more detailed till finally Cicero says, this is how you're a good orator, which makes you a good rhetorician. And so really what Quintilian does is he takes it a step further. And he decides that he needs to justify this particular work with the people that he's teaching, which would be the sons of the Caesars and the senators and the people in power already, and teach them basically how to maintain their power. So essentially, he goes through piece by piece everyone's definition of rhetoric, and he goes through the thought that rhetoric, a good rhetorician is a good person who speaks well. And that's his definition of that. A good person who speaks well. And he goes into incredible detail about why he's explaining that. He says that if you are an orator practicing persuasion, that does not make you a rhetorician. What makes you a rhetorician is your goodwill and intent towards the audience. You're seeking out of the good, again, whatever that is. One of my students in class asked, what is the good here? What are we talking about? And so honestly, there's no answer for that. There's no single answer for that, because I think that it's situational, but I also think that Quintilian was really looking at intent. So establishing goodwill for the audience. Now, do I think that there are times when people say, I'm doing this for you, I'm doing this for the benefit of the country, I'm doing this for the benefit of such and such people, and do they mean it? That is a question that we have to ask ourselves, and that's sort of more the philosophical side of oratory, right, at that point. And it's when those two, you're a good speaker and a good person, when those two come together that you're practicing the art of rhetoric. Quintilian, therefore, is very specific because of the time period that he's living in. He wants to stay alive, so what's the first thing you should do? If you can equate a good speaker with being a good person, and he starts to flip it around a little bit and says, if you're a good speaker, then that can contribute to you being a good person. Why would he say that? Well, because these people who want to stay in power, he wants them to read his work and he wants them to buy into his point. And I think the reason why he does that is because he wants to get these future leaders that he's teaching to understand why Cicero was good, why Aristotle was good, why Isocrates was good, why Plato didn't actually hate rhetoric. He hated the fact that it could be used as a tool for good or evil, because he did not understand that in order to truly be a rhetorician, you had to be doing good. Again, that's where that debate with Aristotle and Plato come in. So it's a matter of, for Quintilian, definitions. So there's really four things I want you to get out of these readings from Quintilian. The first is that he defines rhetoric as a good person speaking well. The second thing that's important for you to know is that he did believe there was a such thing as a perfect orator. And the perfect orator was Cicero. Now, it's interesting because he says that Cicero was not perfect because he didn't live long enough to perfect his craft, his practice of rhetoric. But if he had been able to live longer, and Quintilian even acknowledges, like, he died for the right reasons. Obviously, you guys had to kill him. But had he lived longer, he would have tempered his youthful indiscretions, and he would have made the right decisions in how he was speaking, and therefore he would have been the perfect orator. Now, how Quintilian knows that, I don't know, but of course, because we know that Cicero was an incredibly good man based on Quintilian's assessment, then he also was, in fact, a good rhetorician. And so that's where we end up with that. The third thing that I think it's important for us to draw out of this was that Quintilian does not rewrite a public speaking handbook, because he's not writing for students, really. He's writing for people who are already in power, and he's writing for people who want to maintain that power, not for people who need to gain it. Because remember that Cicero was killed because he was trying to help people learn how to gain knowledge. And that's where the science part of this comes in. So Quintilian is very specific to say that rhetoric is not science. Rhetoric is not oratory without ethics. Oratory is not just being a good person, but being able to speak well. Oratory is not just an art because it does have direction, but it does not have an end goal. And he goes through each of these pieces in order to produce an argument that the higher ups would not slaughter him for. And that was super helpful to Quintilian at the time, to both stay alive and also be able to craft Cicero's work in the best way possible in order to be able to have some sort of discussion of rhetoric without the empire coming down on him and punishing him. The fourth thing that we really need to understand out of Quintilian is that he is writing 200 years after Cicero, and he is also writing just as the empire is extremely strong and moving into the idea of the Holy Empire, Roman Empire. And what's interesting about it is that Quintilian seems to really be trying to use Cicero's ideas and convince people that Cicero was right, which would require a decentralized power. But what we get is more centralized. In this case, later on, we move into the church being the overseer, and we move into a system of monarchy and what we ultimately call the feudal system. And so we are going to enter an era very soon where education is completely irrelevant because there was no progression of science. The church had the source of the Bible, and that was the only thing that was right, and that was the only thing that would be taught, and therefore we don't progress in finding truth any more than looking at the Bible. We will encounter a few people who will preach about that particular part, that the Bible is a rhetorical work, and some other things. But the next, really, depending on what historian you listen to, 800 to 1600 years. So really, a fourth to a whole three-fourths of the course of study that we are undertaking in this semester is spent in what we call the Dark Ages, or the medieval period. And the Dark Ages are dark because no learning is going on. And no learning is going on because Quintilian and others were all dampened down, and we were told that rhetoric was evil and that we should not practice rhetoric. And this feudal system that we move into really reifies that idea of the centralized power. And the distribution of power is distributed with material goods and with money, down to the knights who have lords who run their fiefdoms, and the peasants that work on those fiefs, those pieces of land that a lord might own. And then they each had their own little section of the land that they tilled for literally generations. So you might live on the land of a particular lord, and you're growing food on a certain portion of his land, and you're not paid. Some people would call this an indentured servitude. And you did all of this so that the Lord would have mercy on you and allow you to live. And then whatever went to the Lord built up for the knight, and the knight took with him to go to the court and to fight for the king and queen. And that's sort of the hierarchy that we get there. Once we move into that and move away from classical Rome, we will no longer be looking at rhetoric as a way of distributing power, gaining power, or even spreading knowledge. So that's what we're headed into, is literally the Dark Ages, in the sense that no progress will be made in science, in finding truth, in seeking out other ways of learning. There will still be those who practice this. There still will be sophists. They are going to travel and move around to places where they can be found, but we are not going to hear from them during the Dark Ages. We will hear from a couple, though, and I'm excited to tell you about that, which we will do more of on Thursday. And on Thursday, I have it slated that I would review for you for the exam, which may be a little bit silly because your exam is open note, open lecture, open everything, open book, whatever you need. And it's really just so that I can see that you are grasping some of the main ideas that we're getting at here in the first portion of the semester. There will be 3 exams. None of them are comprehensive. I guess technically this one is considered comprehensive because we start at the beginning of the semester, but really it's only going through the classics, the classical Greeks, the classical Romans, and that's it. So keep that in mind when you are studying for this exam, that it's really about you demonstrating to me that you can find the answers that I'm looking for. And we'll talk more about that on Thursday. In the meantime, very short, but Quintilian's work is very clear. And if you want a tip, like if you're thinking, well, I didn't read everything, here's a tip. Before each chapter, there is a section of like fragmented sentences that explain exactly what Quintilian's doing in that next chapter. And I mean, one of them is defining a good man and defining speaking well. And apologies for that word man, that is the word they use. So he defines that a little bit for us, or says that he's going to. I don't find that he defines it very well. You may find something different. He also has a great deal of commentary on how the fact that money and land, material things, are not persuasive in of themselves, that a rhetorician has to speak and be persuasive in order to be practicing rhetoric. So, that might get a little disagreement in these days and age. I want you to think hard about people who seem to be giving us a sense of goodwill, that their intent is good, but then what they say is absolutely not good. Think about that. Have you heard anything recently? In the classroom, we discussed this in terms of immigration policy and the bill that's being debated right now, and we had a few other examples. So think of one for yourself, an example where people sound like they have goodwill towards the audience when really what they're telling them may not be good for them at all. This is where Quintilian draws the line on the practice of being a rhetorician versus just being an orator. All right, everybody, that's it. I'm going to close it up. I will talk to you again on Thursday.